So today I want to go over a variation of the last Stormclaw drilled build I went over, and I think this one is going to be quite a bit stronger. And this variation is going to be pretty similar to my last build with some small changes that actually have a pretty massive difference. Now we are going to be using 4 uniques in this build, but the main unique for any Stormclaw druid build to work is Great Staff of the Crone, with the special that claws now a storm skill and also casts Storm Strike at up to 150% base normal damage. So this means anytime you use Claw, Storm Strike is also cast, does more damage. Claw is also a storm skill for a lot more scaling. Then you'll also be getting up to +9 ranks to Claw. So this is the one unique that you actually need for any of these type of builds to work. And that brings us to our skill tree, starting with 5 points into Claw, which is the main ability we're actually going to be using for the majority of our damage. Upgrade 1 increases attack speed. Upgrade 2 has a chance for it to attack twice. And when this procs and it attacks twice, it'll also attack twice with Storm Strike. Then we have 5 points into Storm Strike. This cleaves a little bit and gives you damage reduction. Upgrade 1, it can immobilize enemies. Upgrade 2 can make enemies vulnerable. Then we're going down, we're taking Earthen Bulwark, which just gives you some barrier, but one of the main reasons we're taking it is Upgrade 1 makes you unstoppable. Then we're taking Bloodhowl, which is just a big heal. Upgrade 1, it reduces the cooldown on kills. Upgrade 2 gives you increased attack speed, which is one of the main reasons we're taking it. And this brings us to one of our big changes for the build, which we took our points out of Cyclone Armor and Upgrade 1 and 2 because we need more points for another section in the tree, and instead we put 1 point into Debilitating Roar, which is just a massive damage reduction to all enemies around you. And overall, I think this is a little bit less consistent for damage reduction. This is a much bigger damage reduction, but it's up a lot less than the second upgrade for Cyclone Armor. But like mentioned, we need the points, and I think this is still a pretty good defensive ability. Then we're going down, we're taking Hurricane. This is mainly to proc a bunch of other effects. Upgrade 1 slows enemies, Upgrade 2 makes enemies deal less damage. And then we're going down, and the biggest change to this build is we're changing our ultimate from Petrify over to Cataclysm. And this just spawns a big storm around you that does damage, it spawns twisters, and it spawns a bunch of lightning strikes to constantly hit enemies. And it actually has a very high lucky hit chance, which can proc a bunch of other effects. And then the extra points we need is because we're taking both the upgrades. Increases the duration by 4 seconds, and then upgrade 2, lightning strikes from Cataclysm make enemies vulnerable for 6 seconds. This is really big because it makes basically all enemies vulnerable. The main way we did vulnerable in the last version of the build was just through our Storm Strike, but that wasn't pure AoE, it was only cleave. So this will allow us to have a lot more vulnerable up a lot more of the time. And because Cataclysm does lightning strikes, we have some passives and some effects to our Paragon board that massively buff the damage. So Cataclysm can actually deal some decent damage while proccing a ton of additional effects. And then our capstone is Bestial Rampage. After you're in Werewolf for 2 seconds, gain 30% attack speed for 15 seconds, so this will be up 100% of the time. And then for our passives, we have Predatory Instinct for increased critical strike chance, we have increased movement speed while in Werewolf, we have increased resistances, which is pretty big for capping out your resistances, we have Vigilance, which gives us a DR when using a defensive skill, will be up most of the time. Then we have 1 and 2 Elemental Exposure to get 3 into Endless Tempest, which now buffs our Hurricane, which we had before, and also our Cataclysm. So this passive will be giving us a lot more benefit in this version. And then Bad Omen, a lucky hit, up to a 30% chance would do damage to a vulnerable, immobilize or stunned enemy to spawn a lightning bolt. And this will be proccing more because we have Lightning Storm constantly hitting things with more lightning bolts. And then we're taking Neurotoxin to get Toxic Claws, critical strikes with any werewolf skills, poison enemies. We only care that they're poison to proc other effects. Then Envenom, you and your companions deal massively increased critical strike damage to poison enemies. And if you have a well-rolled necklace, you can get up to 3 more points in this, which are going to be very strong. Then we have 3 into Defiance. Nature skills do increased damage to elites. Then we have Quick Shift. When a shapeshifting skill transforms you into a different form, that'll deal increased damage. To get us 3 points into Heightened Senses, upon shapeshifting into a werewolf, we gain damage reduction against elites for 5 seconds. So just some pretty big damage reduction. And then we have our Spirit Boons, Weariness to take reduced damage from elites, Swooping Attacks for increased attack speed, Avian Wraith for increased critical strike damage. If you feel like you need to be more tanky, you could take out either of these to put it into Iron Feather. I'm assuming Swooping Attacks would actually be better to take out for Iron Feather instead of Avian Wraith, but you probably won't need to be more tanky. Then we have Calamity, which extends the duration of our ultimate skills, which is actually more beneficial to Cataclysm than it was to Petrify. And then we have Masochistic, which is a lucky hit. Critical strikes with shapeshifting skills have up to a 75% chance to heal you for 3% of your max life. And then we have our Companion, which I haven't had a ton of progression since my last version of the build. One of the biggest changes that's going to be made once you progress further is to get the unique stones, Evernight and Genesis, and those are going to change up this a little bit, but these are still going to be pretty good, especially especially until you get the unique stones. So starting off, we have Tempest. Main reason you're taking this is because it's the fastest casting skill for your companion, meaning it can proc other effects very quickly. We have Swift support, so it can cast even quicker. We have Fortify support that gives you Fortify every time this ability is cast, and this is actually the main way we're getting Fortify in this build, and it's quite a lot of Fortify most of the time. Then we have Efficiency support. Anything hit by this ability will give you increased critical strike chance against that enemy. This is really good for boss fights specifically. Then we have a Flash of Adrenaline, which just gives you a multiplicative damage increase. We're using Tactical support to reduce its cooldown. We're using Duration support to increase its duration, and if both of these support stones are max level, so both level 10, Flash of Adrenaline will be up 100% of the time. So that will be very strong, especially once you can get the Genesis Stone, which will increase all the effectiveness by 150%. But until you get the Genesis Stone, I've just been using Gripping support so it can pull in enemies. And also, once you get the Evernight Stone, which gives you +4 ranks to all skills, you want to change out the Efficiency Stone for the Evernight Stone for Tempest, which will just give you permanent uptime and +4 ranks to all skills as well. And then we have our Paragon Boards. Now this may change up a bit once I get my glyphs leveled up more. I haven't leveled up my glyphs a ton since my last video, but this is also a place where I could get a lot of power in this build. So this build isn't even relatively close to the max power it could get, and you can still do all the endgame content. So the first glyph we're using is Territorial. Gives you increased damage to close enemies and damage reduction from close enemies, and this will help a lot with the first board we're taking, which is Thunderstruck. Storm skills deal increased damage equal to 20% of your damage versus close or versus distant. Mine is currently 31% multiplicative damage, which is big, but once you get the Territorial glyph much more leveled up, this will just skyrocket and give you absurd damage increases. Then the glyph we're taking here is Earth and Sky, a buff to magic nodes within range, so damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, storm skill damage, and some additional primary stats. Then nature skills deal 10% increased damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Then we're going over to the right, we're taking the Heightened Malice board. While 3 or more enemies are poisoned nearby, which will be always, you deal massively increased multiplicative damage. And the glyph we're taking is Fanged Claw, another buff to magic nodes, so damage to poison enemies, damage reduction from poison enemies, then some additional primary stats. The secondaries, while in werewolf or werebear form, close enemies take increased damage from you, so just another big damage increase. Then we're going up, we're taking the Inner Beast board, and the glyph we're using is Undaunted, which I currently don't really have leveled up that much. Increased damage while fortified, damage reduction while fortified. And it's also pretty important to get the rare and magic nodes over here that give you pretty massively increased attack speed. Then we're going over to the left, we're taking the Earth and Devastation board, and the glyph we're taking is Electrocution. Massively increased lightning bolt and dancing bolt damage, and enemies damaged by your lightning bolts or dancing bolts take 20% increased multiplicative damage from you for 5 seconds. Now this is actually very important that you get this secondary effect, because not only do you get massively increased lightning bolt damage, which helps with multiple parts of our build, including the new ultimate for this variation, but because we're using Cataclysm, things will be getting hit by lightning bolts much more consistently, giving you this big damage increase at all times. Then we're going back over, we're going down, we're going to the right, and we're taking the Lust for Carnage board, and the glyph we're taking is Spirit. Now I currently don't have this leveled up, but it'll give you pretty big critical strike damage increase once you get it leveled up, and once you get the secondary effect, critical strikes will increase the damage enemies take from you by up to 12% multiplicative damage. So another very big damage increase, and again, it's also important to get the rare and magic nodes here that'll give you even more attack speed. And that brings us to our gear, and one of the first things I want to note is that this build is not even doing relatively close to how much damage it could be doing, and that's because with Season 3, Stormclaw Druids actually have much more reliance on getting a few different pieces of gear or different aspects on your gear with really good rolls. Last season, most of your power was in your vampiric powers, so even if you had badly rolled gear, you were still generally fine. But that's not the same with this season. That's why you may see footage of this specific build, because some of the rolls I need aren't very well rolled yet. But starting off, we have our gems. In your weapon, you want basic skill damage. In your gear, you want max life. And then in your jewelry, you want whatever is going to cap you on all your resistances. And if you don't need resistance gems to be capped, put armor gems. But that brings us to our uniques. We went over our Great Staff of the Crone, but then we have one of the most important uniques for this season, which is one of the new uniques, which its special effect is damaging enemies with a non-basic skill marks them for 3 seconds. When a basic skill first hits a marked enemy, that basic skill damage is bounced to all other marked enemies for up to 200% multiplicative increased damage. Now, one of the big reasons why my version of this build is doing less damage right now is because my roll is a low roll on this at 100%, and it can go up to 200%. And because we're using Cataclysm that will constantly be damaging enemies all over your screen, this will be proccing a lot more. So you'll have this damage bouncing a lot lot more than with my last build. So once you get a well-rolled version of these gloves, you'll actually be doing so much more damage than my current version of this build does. And that's the main thing you want to be looking out for as well, is the roll on the special effect for these. And then next up, we have Flicker Step, which each enemy you evade through reduces your active cooldown by up to 4 seconds, up to a total of 10 seconds. So if you dodge through multiple enemies, the cooldown of your Cataclysm will be reduced by 10 seconds. So if you dodge through a pack of enemies like 3 or 4 times, you'll have your ultimate back very quickly. And the implicit of these reduces the cooldown of your evade by 1.2 seconds, so you'll constantly be getting it back very quickly. And then our final unique is the Malignant Ring, which when casting an ultimate skill, and again 5 seconds after, you pull in distant enemies and deal a small chunk of base physical damage to them. This damage is increased by 1% per point of willpower you have, and that damage increase is multiplicative. I have almost 900 willpower, so that's almost 900% increased multiplicative damage to the damage that this causes when it pulls enemies. And because we can always get our ultimate back, this will actually be doing quite a lot of damage over time. And then for our offensive aspects on our necklace, we have basic skills gain increased attack speed, pretty self-explanatory. But then we have another one of the big ways where I can get massively increased damage and is one of your most important roles for this season. And this effect is that when cast at or above 50% maximum resource, basic skills deal up to 80% increased multiplicative damage. My version is currently a low roll as well. I've been pretty unlucky with those. That's an absurd damage increase. And because we don't actually use Spirit in these Stormclaw builds, this will just be a damage increase. So if you can get a good roll on this, or say a max roll, that'll just be 80% increased multiplicative damage for basically all of our main damage. So that's absolutely massive. And again, I have a low roll on this. So if I just get a better roll on this aspect and on my unique gloves, the damage of this build could easily more than double. So keep that in mind when you're seeing footage of this build, where I can still pretty easily do, say, any tier of Nightmare Dungeons. Just keep in mind you could potentially be doubling the damage of this. And then we have our defensive aspects. First being you gain a pretty big increase to your armor, but your evade has 100% increased cooldown. Now with the armor from this helmet, you'll have capped out armor with no difficulties. You don't need disobedience. And what's really good about this is that the increase to cooldown of evade doesn't matter that much when we're using Flicker Step, because of the implicit that reduces your cooldown on attack. So you'll attack a couple times and you'll have your cooldown of evade back. So you kind of negate the downside of this. Then we have basic skills grant 20% damage reduction. You don't really care about the roll on this because it's just the duration and we're always spamming our basics. And then our last defensive is you gain up to 15% damage reduction while in Werewolf, which will be most of the time. So a lot of your damage reduction and damage mitigation is going to come from your 3 defensive aspects. And like all of my build videos now, I'm not going to be going over the stats of my gear in the video, but make sure to go check out the build planner in the description. That will have all of the best gear stats, or what I think are the best stats, laid out, very easy to read. And I think that's just much easier for viewers and to make sure the videos aren't super long. But that's the entirety of the build. And I do think this version of a Stormclaw Druid is going to be a bit better than my last version, primarily because Cataclysm helps proc so many different effects much better than Petrify did, but we don't have that big AoE stun, which if you're having a tougher time surviving, the Petrifying version may actually be better for you because you get to just constantly AoE stun everything. And the main difference in playstyle with this version compared to that version is you're going to want to always have Cataclysm up. Mine is currently at a duration of 17.25 seconds, so you want to make sure you use your evade through enemies enough to make sure you can Cataclysm again after the duration is done. And this will also add some pretty big passive damage as well. So this build, still very good, even with my horrible rolls, can still basically do all content in the game, and this build is actually generally pretty tanky. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment.